Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some very important news out of the state of Iowa, where the Republican Attorney General and longtime speculated candidate for governor in 2026, Brenna Bird, is officially running for re-election and not running for Iowa governor in 2026. The article from CBS 2 Iowa talks about Iowa Attorney General Brenna Bird not running for governor in 2026. Bird had been considering a run for the state's highest position and even hinted at it in a social media video earlier this year. She said, quote, "I was born and raised on a farm, and one thing I know is that you don't stop halfway through a job," Bird told the Des Moines Register. "We have accomplished big victories, stopping scammers, fighting for victims, standing up for law enforcement, and defending our constitutional rights, but there is still more work to do." Republicans who are officially running for governor so far in 2026, Congressman Randy Feenstra, Iowa State Rep. Eddie Andrews, and former state lawmaker Brad Sherman. Democrats running include Iowa Auditor Rob Sand, Paul Dahl, Julie Stauch, and Sandra Wilson. I'll be getting more on the candidates in just a moment, but first, I want to show you what the statement Bird released was on her official Twitter page. Brenna Bird said, and I quote, "I have been overwhelmed by the number of Iowans who have encouraged me to run for governor. I want you to know there is no way for me to adequately express my appreciation for your kind words and the faith you expressed in me. In 2022, we defeated the longest-serving Attorney General in U.S. history. I was born and raised on a farm, and one thing I know is that you don't stop halfway through a job. We have accomplished big victories, stopping scammers, fighting for victims, standing up for law enforcement, and defending our constitutional rights, but there is still more work to do. I know how important it is that we support our law enforcement heroes, convict criminals, and advocate for victims. As Attorney General, I am responsible for upholding our Constitution and laws, a responsibility I take seriously. As a prosecutor, I know how important it is to uphold the rule of law. As a mom, I want to protect our children and keep them safe. I'm absolutely determined to do justice and hold this office to prevent it from being occupied by a radical progressive Democrat who would undo all what we've accomplished. That is why I've decided to run for re-election for Attorney General in 2026. Between now and next November, I will run a fierce re-election campaign, and I will win. I will also enthusiastically support our Republican nominee for governor and the entire Republican ticket here in Iowa. Our party will be unified. I remain grateful for the opportunity to serve Iowans as their Attorney General, and I look forward to earning their support once again." That's the official statement that Bird put out. Now, talking about this race overall, this election, which will be happening a part of the midterms on November 3rd, 2026, will be electing a new governor of Iowa. On April 11th, 2025, the incumbent Republican Governor Kim Reynolds, who was eligible to run for a third consecutive term, as Iowa does not have governor term limits, decided she would not be seeking a third term. So now this race is wide open. 3 Republicans are currently in the race, though it's worth noting from the last time I did a video about Iowa's governor's race, several Republicans have ruled out runs and have decided to either run for re-election to their respective offices or just decline to run outright or run for other positions. However, 3 Republicans are running: Eddie Andrews, a state representative from the 43rd District in Iowa, Randy Feenstra, U.S. representative from Iowa's 4th District, and Brad Sherman, a former state representative from the 91st. For a while, I talked about this race and saying that I assumed Brenna Bird would get in the race, and if she did, I think she would start out as the favorite. Now that Bird is not running, I would say so far of these 3 candidates, Randy Feenstra, the U.S. representative, has the highest name recognition of the 3 Republicans and the highest office of Iowa's 4th District, so he would likely start out as the early favorite to win this primary. A state senator, Mike Bousselot, has also formed an exploratory committee to run. State Representative Bobby Kaufman and Amy Sinclair, president of the Iowa Senate, have both expressed interest in running for this race. Right now, I do think that Feenstra is the most likely Republican to be the nominee, but again, this is still very early on in the race. We're going to have to wait and see how it all develops going forward. On the Democratic side, 4 Democrats are running, but the one that a lot of people nationally and a lot of Democrats in Iowa are talking about is Rob Sand, Iowa's Auditor of State. He is the only Democratic elected statewide right now for Iowa for the Democrats, and he is one of the best Democratic recruits that you could possibly get for Iowa in 2026. He is running in this race, and it gives the Democrats a rare opportunity at making this governor's race very competitive. Sand also already has the endorsement of neighboring Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota and the End Citizens United PAC, which obviously seeks to overturn Citizens United in the Federal Election Commission case the Supreme Court decided back, I believe, in 2010. This race right now, actually for Iowa, shows a lot of competitiveness. Cook Politico has it as lean Republican. Inside Elections has it as a battleground. Sabado Crystal Ball has it likely. Race to the White House has it as toss-up. So for these prediction websites, all very highly respected and reputable, have differing opinions on this race. And to me, that says this race could be very competitive. Now, if you don't spend as much time, for instance, as maybe I or some other election YouTubers do on Iowa, you may be thinking, well, Iowa's not really competitive. It's a pretty reliable Republican state now. 2024, Donald Trump won the state by 13.2%. Why could this race be competitive? Well, let's go back a little bit. In 2020, Donald Trump won the state by 8.2%. 2016, it voted for Trump by 9.4%. All three of those were likely Republican wins. 2012 was the last time it went Democrat when Obama won it by 5.8. At the Senate level, it's also been relatively reliable Republican. Chuck Grassley won it by 12.2% in 2022. In 2020, Joni Ernst, who is up for re-election again in 2026, won it by 6.5. So again, this seems to be much more of a likely Republican seat. The governor level has been a little bit more interesting. 2022, which was a more Republican-favored midterm year, it didn't end up being that way exactly, but it was supposed to be a very good night for the Republicans, where in some cases it was. Kim Reynolds won re-election by 18.5%, a safe Republican victory. So from that standpoint alone, it shouldn't be competitive. However, recent approval numbers show that Kim Reynolds' approval ratings right now are not very high, and that could have contributed to why she's not running for re-election for governor of Iowa. And it should be worth noting, when she first got elected back in 2018, Reynolds only won by 2.7% in this race against her Democratic opponent. 2018, coincidentally, was also the last time there was a midterm election up when President Trump was president. And when President Trump's president, that means the Democrats, who are the off-year party, historically do well in the midterms. That's what 2026 is setting up to be. Historically, the Democrats should be the ones for a good night in 2026, not the Republicans. This election showed Kim Reynolds only getting 667,275 votes to the Democrats' 630,986. So a very competitive election when everything was said and done. And seeing as the election environment should be most similar to this one, rather than 2022, it's possible this race becomes very competitive in 2026 for the Democrats. My most recent election prediction for the governor's races, which just came out a few days ago, I actually have this race starting out as lean Republican. It is worth noting the Republicans don't have who I view the best candidate in Brenna at the top of the ticket anymore, and I do weigh into possibility of Rob Sand being a very strong Democratic candidate for the general election. And I think Republicans that don't acknowledge that Rob Sand is a unique Democratic candidate that could make this race very close, maybe doing so at their own peril. So with those factored in, and Iowa's election history of being more of a likely Republican state, but with the potential to be competitive in the right election environment, I currently have it going to the Republicans in the lean margin, which would be approximately 1 to 5% margin of victory. I think it'd be more likely to be around the 4.5% range than the 1-point range, but I do think that Iowa could be more competitive this time around, and the governor's race with Rob Sand could get very interesting. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are, though. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today, we have a very interesting topic out of the state of South Carolina, where Republican incumbent Senator Lindsey Graham gets a very big GOP primary challenge from Andre Bauer, the former South Carolina lieutenant governor. So the way this begins is former South Carolina Lieutenant Governor Andre Bauer is officially mounting a GOP primary challenge to Senator Lindsey Graham, arguing that the incumbent isn't conservative enough to represent the state. This is very interesting as Bauer, who a wealthy developer, is a longtime backer of President Donald Trump. His candidacy sets up a midterm grudge match with Graham, a 4-term senator, whose relationship with Trump is undulated through the years, but who has Trump already endorsed for re-election. Bauer has described himself as, quote, a real America First conservative intent on representing what he sees as South Carolina conservatives. I think Graham has been there too long and he votes like it, Bauer told the Associated Press on Tuesday. I'm guaranteed I'm conservative and I don't think he is. Republicans dominate South Carolina's statewide elected positions, meaning that the most intense political competition takes place in GOP primaries. Graham has faced previous primary challenges from the right, with opponents accusing him of kowtowing to Democrats on issues from immigration to climate change, but he also hews to Republican priorities on national security. Ahead of last month's U.S. strike in Iranian facilities, Graham called for Trump to, quote, go all in backing Israel and destroying Iran's nuclear program. Graham kicked off his re-election campaign in February, and at least one other Republican has also announced a primary challenge. Graham has already secured President Trump's endorsement. This week, Graham's campaign announced that Chris LaCivita, a co-campaign manager of Trump's 2024 bid, would serve as a senior advisor. On Tuesday, Abby Zilch, a spokeswoman for Graham's campaign, noted that the senator had earned Trump's complete and total endorsement, adding that Bauer has spent his career chasing titles to feed his ego. Bauer said he understood Trump's need to use Capitol Hill relationships to advance legislative priorities like the tax cuts and spending bill that came before the Senate Budget Committee, which Graham chairs, before passing the chamber earlier Tuesday. Trump's got to work and he gets his bills passed, Bauer said. Lindsey's chairman of a major committee. I get what you have to do. Bauer has backed Trump since before his win in South Carolina in the 2016 Republican primary. At his 2024 campaign South Carolina launch event, Trump called Bauer, who served on a state leadership committee, a friend of mine, somebody that I think could run for almost any office and win. Bauer served in the South Carolina legislature before at 33. He was elected as the youngest lieutenant governor in the country in 2002. After 2 terms, he mounted an unsuccessful 2010 gubernatorial bid, finishing last in a 4-way GOP primary, which was ultimately won by Nikki Haley. 2 years later, Bauer ran for Congress, losing a GOP runoff to eventual Representative Tom Rice in South Carolina's newly created 7th District. Asked how much of his own money he would commit, Bauer declined to give a figure, saying he would put skin in the campaign and look forward to returning to the trail. I'm going to cover the state like the dew covers Dixie, Bauer said. I think you're going to see a movement. And this AP News article was written by Meg Kennard. So this is a very interesting story because Senator Lindsey Graham is someone that a lot of both Democrats and Republicans know who he is and know who he is well. And it's not usually for a great reason. The most recent polling data that I could find was from Winthrop University, a South Carolina university, showed that in the approval ratings for May, President Trump had about a 45% approval number. Governor Henry McMaster had about 42%. Senator Tim Scott had about 41%. Lindsey Graham only had 34%. And it doesn't give what the disapproval numbers were, but you can imagine that President Trump was probably right around even. Governor McMaster probably as well. A lot of voters in South Carolina probably not knowing or having a strong opinion on these governors and senators and president. Lindsey Graham, however, 34% is a legitimate concern. Because to me, with a number at 34%, that probably says that there's a sizable amount of Republicans, independents, and Democrats who do not like Senator Lindsey Graham and would probably like to see someone else be senator from South Carolina. And as we talk about this race, it's certainly good news for Lindsey Graham that he has the endorsement of President Trump. That is very good news for him. He probably would be in a lot much of a tougher situation without it. But Andre Bauer, who is mounting a pro-Trump primary campaign, it's not the exact same, but it echoes a little bit to the Texas Senate race with John Cornyn versus Ken Paxton. Someone that enough Republicans in the state may dislike Lindsey Graham so much that Trump's endorsement may not even matter as much as it may in other states due to the fact of how they feel about Lindsey Graham. Now, Bauer and Graham are the 2 most notable candidates running. Mark Lynch and Thomas Murphy are also running. I just want to show also what the polling showed in this race. When it was just Lindsey Graham versus Mark Lynch, Graham led in 2 polls, 48-23 to 43-29 in both of these polls. So Graham had a very sizable lead over Mark Lynch, with 29% of the vote undecided. But this should be worth noting, this is also Lindsey Graham with the endorsement of President Trump, and against Mark Lynch, who, no disrespect to Mark Lynch, is not someone that's very well known in the state of South Carolina. Andre Bauer was the former lieutenant governor from 2003 to 2011. Now, he's been out of elected office for a while now. This is going to be, about 15 years come 2026, but he has a higher amount of name recognition, I would argue, than Lynch or Murphy, which should make him a more formidable opponent. President Trump's endorsement of Graham is certainly going to help him in this primary, and that makes it a tough fight for Bauer to be able to get enough votes to defeat Graham. But enough Republicans who are dissatisfied with Lindsey Graham, even though they probably really love President Trump, enough of them might still vote for Bauer due to the fact they don't like Graham. There's real potential here of a Republican primary. Mark Lynch, again, who is not someone that's super well known, was able to raise about $5.1 million in this race, even though Trump endorsed Graham. What can Andre Bauer do? That remains to be seen, but that could get very interesting very, very quickly. So that's the two polls been done so far. I'm very fascinated for when the first Graham versus Bauer poll comes out, because I would not be shocked to see it be more competitive than these polls against Lynch, where Graham may be around 43-44%, but would Bauer be up in the mid to high 30%, could be something to watch for as well. The sad reality for this race is the primary is probably the most interesting and competitive part of this race. In terms of an electability conversation, the Democrats have 4 Democrats running, including Catherine Fleming Bruce, a candidate for Senate in 2022, Annie Andrews, a candidate for the House in 2022, and 2 other Democrats, Kyle Freeman and Lee Johnson. But South Carolina usually is not a very competitive state in the general election. Inside elections, Cook Politico, Sablo Crystal Ball, and Race to the White House. 3 of them have it listed as safe Republican. Race to the White House has it as likely. All 4 of these are political prediction websites that are all highly reputable, and they all have this race as pretty reliably Republican. When you look at the election history for the state of South Carolina at the Senate level, Tim Scott just won by 26 points in 2024. However, back in 2020, Lindsey Graham only won by 10.3%. I think this says more about Lindsey Graham's electability than it does about South Carolina overall as a state. As again, we saw it in 2024, just vote for Donald Trump by about 18 points. So it's possible the margin of victory may be under 15%, but again, I think that says more about Lindsey Graham than it does about South Carolina. I would even argue if Andre Bauer is the Republican candidate, we likely see South Carolina go more Republican than we would if Lindsey Graham were to be the candidate. But could it be competitive? Well, the Democrats in 2020, when Jamie Harrison, the Democrat, ran, he raised the most amount of money ever for a Senate race, even though it looked pretty clear that the Democrats didn't have really much of a chance at winning this race, given how red of a state that South Carolina was. But still, I think there was so much animosity and dislike for Lindsey Graham among Democrats, and even a lot of independents. Jamie Harrison was able to raise so much money and made it a 10-point race, and also propelled Jamie Harrison to becoming head of the Democratic National Committee. I would not be shocked one bit to see the Democrats put a lot of money into this race if Lindsey Graham's the Republican nominee, just due to the fact that how much they dislike him in the party. However, from an electability standpoint, my most recent election prediction, this is just another video I was doing here, but for the state of South Carolina for 2026, I would still start it out as solid Republican, even though 2026 is supposed to be more of a Democratic wave year. I think whoever the Republican ends up being is more likely to win this race than not. It's possible, again, it goes below 15% margin of victory if Lindsey Graham's a Republican nominee, but even still, I don't think it'd be by much. I think it'd probably be about a 14 to 13 point win. But I think Lindsey Graham's probably going to win re-election without too much of a problem. But this Republican primary has the potential to get very, very close. And like Texas with Cornyn and Paxton, could be one where a few handful of votes could decide if Lindsey Graham survives his primary challenge or not. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today I'm talking about the 2026 Georgia governor's race, and a very interesting development here, as the former Republican Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan is weighing whether to run for governor as a Democrat in the state of Georgia. If you're unfamiliar with the name Geoff Duncan, you may remember some of the fallout of the 2020 presidential election with President Trump with the state of Georgia with Brian Kemp, with Lieutenant Governor Geoff Duncan, and how that all unfolded. There are other videos on YouTube and other websites online that can explain it much better than I could, but essentially there was a massive falling out between President Trump and Governor Kemp and the Lieutenant Governor Duncan and the Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. And President Trump went after all 3 of them, attempting to primary all 3. The only one that President Trump was successful in getting rid of, essentially, was Geoff Duncan. Now, Geoff Duncan, however, the former Republican lieutenant governor, in that article that I just showed you at the beginning, is now reportedly considering running for governor of Georgia as a Democrat. So this is very interesting because Duncan, being a former Republican, certainly has a vendetta of sorts against the Republican Party and against President Trump and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party specifically, which would probably making him express interest in wanting to run for this race as a Democrat. However, Georgia is expected to be a very close race in 2026. Would the Democratic voters in a Democratic primary vote for a former Republican to lead them in a state like Georgia, which, no offense to, for instance, the state of Florida, where a former Republican is running for governor there as a Democrat? Florida, the chances of a Democrat getting elected governor are a lot less than they are in Georgia. So I'm not sure the Democrats in Georgia go down this route, but it could be something very interesting to monitor. The governor's race in Georgia right now has 4 Democrats running in: Oljumi Brown, a church founder; Jason Estevez, a state senator; Derek Jackson, a state representative; and the most highly well-known, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who was the former mayor of Atlanta from 2018 to 2022. She's currently the most well-known candidate running. However, a handful of other Democrats have expressed interest, including Mike Thurmond, the former DeKalb County CEO; Lucy McBath, the U.S. representative from the 6th District. Now Geoff Duncan throws his name into the list as a potential candidate. But all eyes are on Stacey Abrams, the former Democratic nominee for governor in 2018 and 2022. And I'll be getting into the election results of Georgia in just a second. But as for the Democratic primary, it's very likely if Geoff Duncan does decide to run, he's going to be going up against, at very least, Keisha Lance Bottoms and possibly Stacey Abrams. Duncan's chances at winning that primary would not start out very high. Now, Geoff Duncan, if he got to the general election, it's possible, being a former Republican, that if there are some Republicans in Georgia who are dissatisfied with the president, I don't think there's still a large number of them, but if there are any, he may be able to get some of those Republicans. Would the Democrats throw all their weight behind Geoff Duncan the same way they would, for instance, with Keisha Lance Bottoms or Stacey Abrams? That's where I question the electability aspect of Geoff Duncan. He's someone that if he got to the general election, things could be very interesting. It'd be a very interesting case study to see how he would do, but I don't know if he would get the full support of the National Democratic Party like the same way as Stacey Abrams or Keisha Lance Bottoms would. Now, it is also worth noting the Republican side of things is pretty interesting as well. Right now, Chris Carr, the Attorney General of Georgia, is the only declared Republican in this race. 2 other Republicans have expressed interest, though: Marjorie Taylor Greene and Burt Jones, Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. It's anyone's guess if they are going to run, but right now Chris Carr is the presumptive Republican nominee. He's much more in the Brian Kemp mold of a Republican than in the Donald Trump mold, which in the state of Georgia probably gives Chris Carr a better chance at winning a general election. And if he were to face off against someone like Geoff Duncan, Carr would probably have an easier time at defending a lot of the claims and statements that Duncan would make than someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene that's more aligned very closely with President Trump. Another X-Factor candidate here is the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. He's listed as a potential candidate for both Senate and governor. He has not officially said if he's going to run for them or if he's going to run at all for either position in 2026, but he's someone, again, with very close ties to Governor Kemp that could be a very formidable Republican candidate in the general election. The question would be, would Raffensperger get through the Republican primary, again, given everything surrounding the 2020 presidential election? That remains to be seen. But the Republican primary, for now, until otherwise, I would say starts out with Chris Carr as the favorite. The Democratic side is completely wide open. Geoff Duncan's name being in this mix would be very interesting, but I'm not sure he would start out as the likely Democratic nominee at this time. As for the Democratic primary, only one poll was taken from back in September of 2023, but it clearly shows Stacey Abrams had a large lead over the Democratic Party at that time in that race. This election is going to be very close. Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, and Race to the White House, and Sablo Crystal Ball, 4 highly respected political prediction websites. 3 out of the 4 have it listed as a toss-up. Sablo Crystal Ball has it listed as lean Republican. And if you've been following the state of Georgia, you really know why. Georgia's been one of the closest states in American politics in the last few years. At the governor level, though, it's actually been more Republican than it has been at the national level. Brian Kemp won re-election for governor by 7.5% against Stacey Abrams in 2022. Kemp getting about 2.1 million votes, Abrams getting about 1.8 million, roughly around 300,000 votes separating them. This was a very good performance and very big win for Brian Kemp. After 4 years before that, in 2018, Kemp and Abrams had one of the closest races in the United States in this election. Kemp won by 1.4% against Stacey Abrams, Kemp getting 1,978,408 votes, Abrams here got 1,923,685. So roughly only about 50,000 votes or so, about 54,000 votes separating Kemp and Abrams in this very close race in Georgia. So re-election, Kemp did very well, but the first time around, he got elected by a very narrow margin, and that's something the Democrats are going to be looking to go after in 2026, is a race more likely to be like 2018, which also was a very strong year for the Democrats. That's more likely to be what the governor's race will look like in 2026 than when Kemp won re-election by 7.5% in 2022. So that's at the governor level. At the Senate level, Georgia's actually been a little bit of a different case. In 2022, Democrat Raphael Warnock won re-election against Republican Herschel Walker by about 2.8%. That would be a lean Democratic win for the Democrats. And then back in 2020, this is when the runoff election, because neither Republican nor Democratic candidate broke 50% of the vote on Election Day, it went to a runoff on, I believe, January 3rd, and it showed Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock both winning their respective races by a lean Democratic margin. Ossoff defeated Republican David Perdue by 1.2%. Warnock defeated Republican Kelly Loeffler by 2.1%. So the last two elections at the Senate level have both been lean Democratic. The presidential level, it's been both. President Trump flipped Georgia in 2024, winning it by 2.2% against Kamala Harris, though it is worth noting when you compare how a lot of states shifted across the country, pretty much everywhere shifted towards the Republicans, Georgia actually only shifted by not that much. Trump ended up winning Georgia by 2.4%, or shifted towards Trump by 2.4%. That was one of the smaller shifts compared to a lot of other states and a lot of other swing states. Nevada shifted by 5.5%, Arizona 5.5%, North Carolina about 1.9%, Wisconsin 1.5%, Michigan 4.2%, Pennsylvania 2.9%. Georgia was in the bottom half of the toss-up states in terms of how much it shifted to the Republicans, and that's something Democrats are looking to capitalize on for 2024, especially after Joe Biden in 2020 provided the roadmap for how Democrats can win the state of Georgia at the presidential level, winning it by 0.24%. And again, as I mentioned, this is where that whole situation with President Trump, Brian Kemp, Brad Raffensperger, and Geoff Duncan all came to unfold. Biden here got 2,473,633 votes. Trump got 2,461,854 votes. This was roughly about 12,000 votes separating Biden and Trump in 2020 in the state of Georgia. If the Democrats are going to win this state in 2026, they have to try and replicate the map that Joe Biden did in 2020 and Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock were able to do in 2020 and 2022, respectively. It gives the Democrats a very clear way and very clear margins to line out on how things go. Georgia does have an interesting rule where the candidate who wins has to break 50% of the vote at the governor and Senate level. On the first round of voting, Raphael Warnock didn't actually break 50%, so it did go to a runoff. But at 49.44%, it showed he was the leader going into that election runoff. The Democrats likely to win this election, they could probably win without a runoff in 2026, but to win the governor's race, they would probably need to go to a runoff election to win. That, in my view, would be the best case for the Democrats at trying to do that, as at the governor level, the Republicans probably have a slight advantage in this race. The most recent election prediction I have for the governor's maps, and my most recent prediction, I did give the state of Georgia to the Republicans, making it lean Republican. I think it's going to be by around 1.5% to 2%. Again, I do think it's possible it may take a runoff election for that to happen, but I did have Chris Carr winning this race by a lean Republican margin. But I would not be shocked come Election Day to see the Democrats nearly flip Georgia. I think this would be indicative of a larger Democratic wave, more on par with what we saw in 2018 than what we saw in 2022 if this were to happen, as this would be the Democrats not having a very good election night by like 2 or 3% nationally. I think this would be Democrats having a very good election night by like 7 or 8% nationally if Georgia were to go blue. But Democrats could certainly win the state of Georgia and are certainly trying to win the state at the governor level, as well as defending their Senate seat that's up as well. But I do think the Republicans are favored to hold on to Georgia right now. But the prospect of Geoff Duncan running, I don't think it ultimately happens where he becomes a Democratic nominee. But it's a very interesting conversation, for instance, in the Democratic debates maybe, at points he may raise in campaigning that Democrats may try and use against the Republicans in the general election. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts about this and other videos you'd like to see me cover. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in a future video.